It's December 1776. A young American nation finds itself in a war for independence from Britain, the most powerful country in the world. America is losing. With the British snapping at his heels, America's General George Washington has retreated across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. His force in threadbare uniforms, many without shoes. The American commander is desperate. In a war for the life of a nation, Washington leads a group of ragtag, untrained, divergent men from each corner and crevice of the new country. Their morale has never been lower, and to make things worse, after recent losses at the Battle of White Plains in October and Forts Washington and Lee in November, the new year is now approaching, and the probability of his men re-enlisting and more men enlisting is fading. Washington and America need a miracle.
I believe that this nation should commit itself.
Huddled along the western banks of the Delaware River using the waterway and the weather to keep the British at bay, Washington asks his men to stay for one last effort. The general contemplates his position, and he develops an audacious plan. He and his men will attack Trenton, New Jersey, located 10 miles downriver, controlled by the British and occupied by 1,500 Haitians. The American general believes that he can cross the Delaware River beginning on Christmas Day and invade Trenton before sunrise the morning of December 26th, catching the Haitian soldiers off guard. Washington believes that the surprise attack the morning after Christmas significantly raises his odds for a British defeat and for raising the morale of his soldiers. Washington envisions a three-prong attack. General James Ewing's men will prevent the Hessian force from escaping. Colonel John Cadwalader's militia will prevent reinforcements from arriving. And Washington and his 2,400 troops will attack head-on. It's Christmas, and Washington assembles his men. He orders Thomas Paine's The Crisis read to the troops.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us. The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Thomas Paine, December 23rd, 1776.
Christmas Day, 1776, started out calm. But by the afternoon, clouds were increasing and temperatures were dropping. A powerful nor'easter was coming and bringing with it bold, cold winds, dark skies, and freezing rain. As thousands of men began to load horses, ammunition, and cannons into the boats and rafts that would carry them across the Delaware, the ice turned to sleet and snow. Ewing and Cadwalader's men could not navigate the icy, angry river, but Washington's men could and would. The crossing of Washington's 2,400 soldiers relied on good boats and able men. Weeks before, as Washington retreated from New Jersey for Pennsylvania, he'd ordered that all the boats in Trenton be put in good order, and that as many boats as possible be collected above and below Trenton and kept from the British until they could be used by the Continental Army. Of these vessels, none was more important than the Durham boat. Often called the secret weapon of the Battle of Trenton, it was anywhere from 40 to 60 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. Developed in Durham, Pennsylvania to transport iron ore and other heavy cargo, 40 soldiers could fit into the boat. To navigate, crew members used oars and steel poles that dug into the riverbed. But when it was time to actually cross the Delaware, Washington had a real problem. Two of his three forces, Ewing and Cadwalader's men, didn't know how to navigate the boats or rafts, particularly in a winter gale. But Washington's force included Colonel John Glover and his experienced watermen from Marblehead, Massachusetts. By a young age, Glover was already a self-made man. An example of American success, he owned a fleet of fishing schooners and operated as an international merchant. He quickly became known as one of the wealthiest and most influential men of the close-knit community of Marblehead. When Britain took away more and more of the colony's political and commercial rights and became more oppressive, Glover became more politically and militarily active, and he raised a regiment of 500 men composed of Marblehead seamen, referred to by Washington as soldiers bred to the sea. Glover's able seamen, aided by local watermen who knew that 300-yard stretch of the Delaware River well, and then the rest of Washington's tired, hungry, and ill-clothed men arduously loaded between 60 and 90 horses onto rafts that night. 3 men were needed to control each horse. General Henry Knox, chief artillery officer, ordered by Washington to direct the crossing, recorded that 18 cannons were also taken across, with each gun and their ammunition taking up to an hour to load and secure. Knox, a close friend of Washington's and later his Secretary of War, wrote in a letter to his wife that the night was cold and stormy. It hailed with great violence. Eventually, the men, boats, rafts, and their contents left one shore for another. Back and forth, back and forth. Strong, determined patriots fought howling winds and driving sleet to bring all the men, horses, and ammunition across the Delaware. One soldier wrote, "It was a violent storm of rain, hail, and snow, coupled with the ice floes and the high winds that slowed operations." These extraordinary weather conditions delayed Washington's plan by over 3 hours, but it's recorded that throughout it all, the general patiently watched as his soldiers implemented his ambitious plot. Once all had arrived on the New Jersey shore, there was no turning back, as evidenced in the password that Washington had selected for this operation: victory or death. By 3 a.m., December 26th, all Washington's men, horses, and equipment had reached the New Jersey shore, but they still had a 10-mile march to Trenton in front of them, and the general's plan to attack under the cover of darkness was ruined. With every delay, his fear of his army being caught in the open grew. Considering his options, Washington was seen brooding on a crate near a fire. He later wrote of this decisive moment, "I was certain there was no making a retreat without being discovered and harassed on repassing the river. So I determined to push on at all events." Washington and his men began the march to Trenton. Most of the men were ill-clad and suffered terribly in the sleet, wind, and snow. One man froze to death on the march.
The route was easily traced, as there was a little snow on the ground, which was tinged here and there with the blood from the feet of the men. Major James Wilkinson.
With the weather delay, the soldiers finally arrived on the outskirts of Trenton right around daybreak. Washington split his men into 2 columns. Major General Nathaniel Greene would attack from the north. Major General John Sullivan would attack from the west and cut off any Hessian retreat. Meanwhile, Colonel Henry Knox would rain cannon fire upon the garrison. Up to this point, Washington and his men had been battling the weather. But now the weather began to fight for them, providing much-needed cover in the light of the new morning. The young American forces were also helped by the Hessians' lack of preparation. Colonel Johann Rall, commander of the garrison, who, despite being warned of the Continental Army's imminent assault on Trenton, did nothing to fortify the city. Part of that reason was because when British General William Howe decided to shelter for the winter, he created a chain of 17 outposts across New Jersey, 3 of which were on the Delaware River, and 1 of which was Trenton. Howe appointed Carl von Donop as overall commander of the river outposts, and Rall was given the command at Trenton. Rall and von Donop didn't like each other, so when von Donop ordered Rall to fortify Trenton, Rall ignored him. However, since mid-December, Rall's troops had been under constant perimeter attacks from New Jersey-based Hunterdon militia and General James Ewing's Pennsylvania militia. Rall and his men were nervous and exhausted. Basically, Trenton's position was indefensible, and Rall had asked for support from von Donop and from the British commander of New Jersey, General James Grant, but his requests had been denied. Lack of support, lack of preparation, bad weather, the holidays, and the Trenton garrison's general contempt for the American soldier, whom they had defeated many times before, all contributed to the shellacking that the Continental Army gave the Hessians the morning of December 26th. Before the fight begins, Washington's men assemble at the intersection of King and Queen Streets at the head of Trenton. It was snowing hard. With Knox cannonballs raining fury upon the town, the order was given to attack, but a great many of the muskets were misfiring due to the heavy snow.
Action!
Recalled one soldier, "We advanced, and orders were given to charge bayonets and rush on we did." Before the surprised Hessians had time to reload their guns, Washington's soldiers were upon them. Henry Knox remembers, "Here succeeded a scene of war which I had often conceived but never saw before. The hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy was not unlike that which will be when the last trumpet shall sound." In some of the fiercest fighting near the Stacy Potts house, two of the very few American casualties occurred: a Captain William Washington, a distant cousin of the general, and a young lieutenant in the 3rd Virginia Regiment, just out of William and Mary College, named James Monroe. Among the many Hessian casualties was Colonel Rahl, who was mortally wounded. After he was shot, his men laid down their weapons and surrendered. After the battle, as Rahl lay dying, he asked Washington to treat his men with humanity. Washington honorably complied. The American Army's running fight through Trenton was a total victory. With a total of 3,900 men engaged in the Battle of Trenton, 2,400 were American patriots and 1,500 were British soldiers. There were 910 estimated casualties, and of those, only 5 were American, and the other 905 British. Even with their one-sided victory, Washington knew that he did not have the men to hold the town of Trenton. So on the same day, December 26th, Washington and his men, cannons, horses, weapons, ammunition, and prisoners crossed back over the Delaware. There were battles to be fought and a war yet to be won, but it can arguably be said that when Washington and his men, against all odds, persevered across the ice-choked Delaware River that cold, inhospitable Christmas night of 1776, it was not unlike another epic event 2,000 years earlier, when the Jordan River was crossed in the same faith of a new and promised land.